Good morning, everyone. I'm very proud to be hosting this timely event and so grateful to all of you for making the time to join us this morning. I want to give special thanks to our distinguished group of speakers who you'll hear from over the course of the morning. We will be joined by United States Senator Edward Markey, State Representative Kate Hogan, Cambridge Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui, the Assistant Commissioner Kathleen Baskin at the Bureau of Water Resources with the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, Dr. Carmen Messerlian from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, Dr. Kristi Pullen Fedinick from the Executive Director of the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, as well as the Assistant Regional Commissioner at the EPA's Region 1 office in Boston, Erin Flannery-Keith. I want to begin by talking a little bit about a question some of you may have, which is why would the district attorney be convening an event dealing with the issue of environmental justice? And I'll tell you what focused my attention on this. A couple of months ago over the summer, I happened to be getting ready for some events we had the next day when in the background I heard a story about something that had taken place in Cambridge. And they were speaking on the radio about the discovery of, quote, forever chemicals in Cambridge's water supply. And I learned, listening to that story, that the city of Cambridge officials had discovered that issue. They had reported it to the appropriate authorities, alerted the public, remained very calm and begun offering solutions and looking into long and short-term investments to prevent future harm. I really then began to think about the evolving and the significant risks that our community's water supplies face from so many fronts, and ways in which certain state and local governments are in some cases rising to meet these immense challenges, while others may not yet have focused their attention on that responsibility that affects their and future generations. I began to closely observe the way that state and local governments across the country were responding to these issues, one of which was Jackson, Mississippi. In that city, there's over an 82% African-American population. More than 150,000 people went without clean running water for several weeks. Just take a second to think about how many times already today you've relied on clean water. And here were people for many weeks. Residents there have since filed a lawsuit claiming that public and private engineering firms entrusted with the upkeep of their water supply had disastrously failed, leading to the experience of a number of health problems, including dehydration, malnutrition, lead poisoning, exposure to E. coli, hair loss, skin rashes, and digestive issues, all caused by the consumption of contaminated water. In the midst of that crisis, Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves gave a speech 90 miles away from Jackson in a town called Hattiesburg. And in a callous remark that may well have revealed his true feelings, Governor Reeves began his speech by declaring to the crowd, "It's a great day to be in Hattiesburg. It is also, as always, a great day not to be in Jackson." Consider for a minute how fortunate we are to live in a commonwealth where our federal, state, and local officials, many of whom are or will be on this call today, offer such a different vision of governing than Governor Reeves and his ilk. Although I don't have a scientific background and have spent my career in the arena of criminal law, I do recognize that one of the greatest privileges I have as district attorney is the power to convene. In the short time that we've been talking about these issues, I've come to realize what a multi-generational issue this is. And that's why we've chosen to convene today's summit. I am, as I hope you are, here to listen, to learn, and hopefully to create a bridge and a connection between the incredible group of experts you will hear from today and state and local officials who either are or may one day be called upon to deal with a water supply crisis. I'm hoping we'll accomplish three key things today. Number one, that we'll examine the scope of the problem of highly toxic forever chemicals that have been found in our drinking water here in Massachusetts. We'll learn a little bit more about the impact on our communities, an impact which we know is not an evenly distributed one. And we will begin to formulate a plan for how we move forward with an approach that makes equity and environmental justice central to our accessing resources. We know from some reporting over the summer that 84 community water systems in Massachusetts have been tested and in which have been detected 6 different toxic forever chemicals above the level of drinking water. The Massachusetts Sierras Club, whose members we're so excited to have here with us today, recently analyzed the state's public water system and found that 70% of our community, 70%, have detectable levels of those 6 most dangerous type of PFAS in their water. So the likelihood is that you're in one of those communities. The scope of this contamination problem is significant, whether it be small towns and big cities, and it is an ongoing issue. The testing, the detection, and the mitigation is all happening in real time. Given the scope of that problem and the research showing that those toxic chemicals pose a real threat and result in tangible, serious harm, I believe that we must come together and take urgent action across discipline and areas. And knowing that these problems are particularly dangerous for babies, for children, for people who are pregnant and adults, in terms of making sure that people can reach their full potential and live their full lifespan. And it is not a problem that can be left just to those who work in the environmental or the public health space. This proactive prevention work in our office is just as imperative as the work that we do prosecuting cases. We have prioritized thinking about the full scope of prevention and coming up with creative solutions, including community partnerships. For example, we've recently launched a dental hygiene partnership with kids that really was based on research showing that almost 80% of kids who display behavioral issues in school are often suffering from poor oral health. I'm very glad that the members of our Safe Babies, Safe Kids Task Force are here today, because that task force looks at the health and well-being of kids from birth to graduation. This is a continuation of that work. I don't want to be involved in someone's life just after a criminal act has been committed. I want to be sure that we're taking meaningful steps to look at research that tells us what can have an impact in the area of intervention, and use that data-driven approach to reduce the chance that someone will ever become involved with the criminal legal system. We know that those of us in the criminal justice space should be playing a role here. The American Psychological Association warned 7 years ago, back in 2015, we know that lead and alcohol can harm a child's brain, but they said a growing amount of research suggests that chemicals known as endocrine disruptors found in everyday household products that include pesticides, plastics, and fire repellents may also contribute to a range of behavioral and learning problems. Many studies show that toxic substances and chemicals have a real impact on brain development and health. In a recently published article, professors at the University of California at Berkeley and Harvard argue that understanding how early exposure to these environmental toxins can widen inequality, that exposure can widen inequality in test scores, cause health problems, and behavioral problems. And that is a critical issue. We all know all of the talk that's been ongoing about brain development. This is another way in which young brains are profoundly affected. Environmental issues like contaminated drinking water can forever change a child or young person's life trajectory and their outcome. Before I turn it over to our first presenter, I also want to touch on the lens through which I hope we will be looking at everything today. Middlesex County is the largest county in this Commonwealth. It is the largest county in the New England states. It consists of 54 cities and towns, communities with substantial socioeconomic diversity and racial diversity, and a number of places that are part of the environmental justice neighborhoods as identified by the state using demographic data. The equity issues at play with respect to the access to safe drinking water are critical. And I want to recognize here at the beginning that the experts who study this and the lived experience in our people in our communities tells us that communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental problems are already under-resourced and bearing the burden of other overlapping problems. That is the common thread, or the lens, if you will, through which I hope we will grapple with all that we discussed today. We need to ensure that we address this issue in a way that fully appreciates the inequity of the access to safe drinking water. You'll hear later today from Dr. Kristi Pullen Fedinick, the Executive Director of the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, which is based in Minneapolis. And she is a former science officer at the National Resources Defense Council. Dr. Fedinick has done extensive research on water safety and how different communities are at risk. She has also worked on in particular on the crisis in Flint, Michigan. She worked on a report which we've included as a part of the materials that you'll have as a drop-down after today's program. And that report, called Watered Down Justice, provides a data-centered look at the relationship between race, income, and drinking water violations. It proves that communities of color, low-income communities, and communities that lack transportation or possess crowded housing conditions have a higher rate of drinking water violations than other communities. At this stage, when, as you'll hear later this morning, a lot of resources have been secured and are available, we must be thinking about how do we ensure that at every level, whether it be local, state, or federal, we guarantee that communities of color, low-income communities, and areas designated as environmental justice communities are prioritized and are getting the resources that they need and deserve. And that's why I'm really so pleased to be bringing together elected leaders who are laser focused on this issue with urgency and equity as a North Star. Environmental officials from the EPA and the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection doing vital work with their commitment to environmental justice, and distinguished experts on the science and the equity-rooted public policy. Access to clean, safe drinking water is a human right, and contaminated toxic water is an unevenly distributed but pervasive problem in Massachusetts. This problem deserves an all hands on deck approach, and all of us have something to contribute in fashioning and putting in place solutions. So thank you again to all of you for being in attendance here, and we'll begin, and I'm very happy to be able to do this in terms of providing what I hope is a good background for everyone, with Dr. Carmen Messerlian, who is an assistant professor of environmental, reproductive, perinatal, and pediatric epidemiology at the Harvard University T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She leads the Harvard Chan School of Public Health's Scientific Early Life Environmental Health and Development, or SEED program. As the director of the SEED program, her team is conducting research to understand how the environment and the world around us is impacting people's reproductive health from the very earliest stages through childhood, including a focus on the adverse health outcomes that result from toxic chemical exposures like PFAS and other emerging contaminants. She's received numerous fellowships and doctoral research grants, as well as the Outstanding Faculty Teaching Award in 2018 and the Chan School of Public Health and Mentor of the Year Award in 2020. Prior to joining Harvard, Dr. Messerlian worked as a pediatric nurse at the Montreal Children's Hospital and as a maternal child public health consultant for government officials. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, a PhD in Epidemiology from McGill, and a Master's in Public Health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In her work, she's looking at education, prevention, and the raising of public awareness. She has said that her goal, and this is part of today's work, I hope, is to generate impactful science using cutting-edge evidence to inform her clinical practices and take the science and translate it into policy action to implement policies that can improve health outcomes. And these are Safe Babies, Safe Kids members who are here have already done so much of that work in looking at these issues. I'm so grateful to have Dr. Messerlian here today to talk about the science behind PFAS and the forever chemicals, their impact, and the public health implications. Welcome, Doctor. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you so much, District Attorney Ryan. I'm so grateful for that introduction. Was too much. I'm just here to serve the people of the United States in the best way I can with the science that I'm passionate about, with an amazing team of scholars that I mentor and teach and educate and train to be future leaders. And I'm grateful to be here today because the work that I do has meaning and impact to people's lives. And without being able to translate that information and that science to people like yourselves, everybody at the table today, and being able to share and communicate and offer solutions to people who make decisions for our people in Massachusetts and across the states, my research has no value. So this is the most important job that I have, is communicating my science to all of you. And I'm very grateful to be here today to do that. I have lots to share. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. I have prepared a presentation and I'm going to, I don't think this is the right screen, just one quick second, presenter view. Do you see just my slides? Or do you see the presenter view?
We see presenter view.
Presenter view, yeah.
Oh, okay, so just 1 second then. 1 second, I've got to do advanced screen. Sometimes it works to do a portion of the screen then. 1 quick second. So I'm just going to move this little box over here like this. Now I hope you see the correct screen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there we go. That's better, right? There we go. Just takes a couple of seconds to do that. Thank you so much. So thanks for the introduction. I won't spend any more time introducing myself, but you could find more information about me on my Twitter handle, and you can email me at any time and check out our work on SEED program website. I want to start with a really important quote, which I think will impassion all of you today, which is a quote from Winnie the Pooh. Your greatness is not what you have, but what you give. And our highest purpose here today, and the people here at the table, is to use our talents and skills and our gifts in the service of others. And that's what I do each and every day. And that's what I know all of you are motivated by. We need to protect children's health. Child health begins before conception, and early life environments are generational. Just like District Attorney Ryan said, that this is a multi-generational issue. Our environment includes the social, built, and natural environments. It's not just one space that we're concerned about. We're concerned about where people grow up, how they live, their environments, discrimination, social structures, the built environment, the home environment, the school environment, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat. And environmental exposures impact our reproductive life across the lifespan. And this is one of the most important things I'd like to communicate here today, which is it's a diagram of the human reproductive cycle. I show this every class, every year at the beginning of my course that I teach at Harvard. We know that healthy reproduction requires complex processes to work in synchrony and sequentially over time. But where does reproduction begin? Gives us some clues to where we can fall and succumb to pathology. Our own reproduction started at the time of fertilization in our mothers, in our mothers' uteruses, and continued on to when we formed embryos and zygotes and a live-born you that grew up in a home and went to school and grew up in an environment that drank water, consumed the air, ate the food. And our reproduction really starts, interestingly enough, well before that. So the eggs that formed you were in your grandmother. So look at this picture and really think and question and understand the impact that the water we're drinking today in Massachusetts. The pregnant women that are exposed today are not just exposing their fetus, but are also exposing their grandchild. And what your grandmother is doing, which is you today, And what your grandfather was doing, which is your partner today, will impact your grandchild's health and possibly even your grandchild's health. So it's a multi-generational impact. And we have a responsibility as legislators, as scientists, to understand how that impact gets translated across time and what can we do today to reduce the burden of risk, the burden of exposure, and the consequences to our future children, our future grandchildren. So that should be our motivating factor. And that's what my program does at the SEED program. We're going to be focusing on what we call the built environment. And that includes, as Justice Ryan said, endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are vast. It's not just perfluorinated chemicals. It's all sorts of chemicals, phthalates, plastics, BPA, disinfection byproducts, which I hope to cover very briefly. Also, water contamination factor that we need to consider that has vast impacts across health. And we are exposed to these chemicals, not in solitude, not one chemical at a time, but our bodies are exposed to a plethora of chemicals from everything that we are exposed to in our built environment and our natural environment and our social environment. And we are exposed to mixtures of chemicals. So we can't really look at these chemicals in isolation. We do scientifically because it facilitates the methodology, and the methodology was built for that. And we're now focusing more on complex mixture analysis that allows us to look at how do these chemicals interact together, synergistically, antagonistically. So we can't just isolate one PFAS, for example, PFOS, and look at the effects of that, because we're not just exposed to PFOS, we're exposed to a complex mixture of PFAS that then interacts with phthalates and BPA and pesticides and air pollution that can impact our health. So that's my job, is to really understand the timing of exposure. And the timing of exposure is really a critical determinant of disease susceptibility. And different periods in the developmental life course, like I showed you in that reproductive cycle, are more or less susceptible to the effects of these chemicals. And one of the most important periods of reproduction that I focus on is what we call the preconception period, the time before we even get pregnant, and how much impact we have to reduce the burden of exposure in that period to improve outcomes. Because by the time a pregnancy is detected, there's already been a ton of growth and development of the embryo and the fetus. And by then, some of the consequences are already set and we can't really go back in time. So changing policy to prevent damage and harm and exposure should be focused on the preconception period. And these chemicals are not just endocrine disrupting, they're also immunotoxic, obesogenic, epitoxic, genetic toxic. They have widespread impacts across human health, across human systems, not just the endocrine system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of their effects. But today we're here to talk about PFAS, which, as you know, are called per and polyfluoral substances, alkyl substances, and they're environmental toxicants of urgent scientific, governmental, and public concern because they are nearly universally exposed across the globe and have widespread adverse health effects. Despite the decades of research that we've already conducted, the consequence of PFAS exposure for humans is really strikingly unclear. PFAS are a family of high production volume synthetic water and stain-resistant chemicals that are used in countless consumer products, including nonstick cookware, textile, and really importantly, food packaging. Indeed, PFAS can be found in the water we drink, the food we eat, the air we breathe, in our homes, in our schools, in our workplaces. PFAS persist in the environment largely because of the strong fluorine-carbon bond of their backbone structure that makes them resistant to biotic, chemical, and mechanical degradation. These chemicals are ubiquitous across the globe in the atmosphere, in fresh ocean waters, and in wildlife. The chemical properties that make PFAS so useful in so many applications also cause them to be persistent in the environment, and they allow for accumulation in the human body where the half-lives, that's how long it takes to break down this chemical in your body, is between 2 and 8 or more years. There are some studies that show that these chemicals, these PFAS chemicals, can stay in our bodies for up to a decade. Indeed, because of this, they've been labeled forever chemicals because they're hard to get rid of in your body. They're hard to get rid of in the environment. They persist across time. The general population across the US is highly exposed. We can detect these chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, for example, in more than 99% of the United States population. We've also detected these chemicals in human amniotic fluid, in cord blood, in neonatal blood. And even though we have phased out the most widely used PFOS, which are PFOA and PFOS, in the early 2000s, human exposure remains prevalent because of the widespread environmental contamination. And there's also concern for all the newer PFAS that have been used and substituted by industry to replace PFOA and PFOS. And so research is lacking in these areas. We still have far to go. I want to tell you a little bit about the sources and roots. There is a really important growing concern, as we've mentioned earlier, in the United States of extensive groundwater contamination with PFAS. And this poses a serious threat, particularly since the drinking water of millions of Americans is likely contaminated at concentrations of concern, as we heard earlier. Diet, including drinking water, and the indoor environment are the main sources of exposure to PFAS. But PFAS can also be detected in our air, in the dust, and in the foods that we eat, including meat, poultry, and fish. Dietary exposure can result both from consuming meat and fish, which is contaminated from PFAS due to bioaccumulation, as well, and very importantly, due to food packaging, which is grease and water resistant. Almost every single food packaging or food contact material has a PFAS on it to prevent water, oil to go and penetrate through the food packaging. So indoor exposure can accumulate via inhalation through dust and ingestion of dust, and also through the oral route of exposure through water and food, or from dermal contact. We also know that these chemicals can pass through breast milk and pass through the maternal fetal mechanism of the placenta. So there's exposure across the human body through different pathways. Now we know that the drinking water in Massachusetts has PFAS detected in many, many regions across the state. These chemicals have been detected all over the map, as you can see in this particular graph. And this is from 2021 data. And PFDA was found in levels larger than 20 parts per trillion. These are levels that concern us from a scientific point of view, even though the regulation of these chemicals set limits. We know that those limits are very hard to manage and to regulate. And so we need to look at mitigation measures. Same story in the United States. We find these chemicals in the drinking water across sites across the United States. Massachusetts is one of the more highly exposed populations in the United States. There's other states that are also highly exposed, but we have several sites that are highly contaminated in Massachusetts. So what are the health effects of these chemicals? I'm going to briefly just say to you that they are associated with a number of general health effects, including cancer, thyroid disease, including hypothyroidism, reproductive dysfunction, including infertility, and immune effects, including asthma, and then liver and kidney damage. From a reproductive standpoint, which is what I focus on, we know that these chemicals are associated with fetal growth and development and survival in both animal and human models. We show that there's, in animal studies, experimental studies, that there's a decrease in the number of pups born alive in a dose-dependent manner. In human babies, there's lower birth weight, lower gestational age, a longer time to pregnancy, which can be associated with infertility. There's also possible anti-androgenic pathways affecting male fertility and semen quality in men. But what we know is that we need more studies. There's so few well-designed, well-conducted studies to understand the reproductive effects. And I've been extremely fortunate to be able to be awarded an R01 by the NIEHS, where I'm conducting a study at the Massachusetts General Hospital at the Fertility Center, where I get to look at these chemicals, a whole host of PFAS that are going to be measured at the Centers for Disease Control by Antonia Califat, and where we will be able to look at semen quality, egg quality, embryo quality, fertilization, implantation, live birth rates, preterm birth, and a whole host of adverse reproductive outcomes in a very well-designed study. And I'm very proud of that work and very grateful for the funding that I've received to do that work. But I want to highlight a couple studies that we're working on currently that I think will highlight indeed the impact that we see of these chemicals in children across the United States. And I'm going to highlight the study that was published on common cold that my student Yu Zhang, who's a doctoral student at Harvard Chan, has been working on. And her entire thesis is focused on the effects of PFAS in children's health, looking at both immune outcomes and birth outcomes. And what we're focusing on is something that empowers us in the population, which is what can we do about it? And is there something in our environment that we can modify in our lifestyle that allows us to reduce the burden on our bodies? So I'll highlight this here now. So we know in animal studies that PFAS are associated with altered immune function in both human and animal studies. We see reduced thymus weights, reduced number of circulating immune cells, reduced antibody production. We're going to highlight this now in a study that shows that in mothers, exposure has been associated with, I'm going to go back one, I skipped over. There we go. Reduced birth weight, reduced preterm birth, higher risk of preterm birth, and a decrease in antibody response, and an increased risk of infection, atopy, or skin reactions. So because we didn't have the data from my clinical study at MGH, and we had time and during the pandemic, we looked at NHANES data, which is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So we looked at the data that was collected across time through many cycles that was funded and conducted with the Centers for Disease Control. And we looked at 517 children between the ages of 3 and 11. And another 2,732 adolescents between the ages of 12 and 19. And these are from cycles 2003 to 2016, so a widespread cohort in terms of time. And what we looked at was the concentrations in the blood of 4 different PFAS compounds, PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHXS. And we looked at parent-reported or self-reported, depending on the age of the child, in the last 30 days, kids that reported cold incidents if they had common cold symptoms of common cold. And we looked at both single chemical analysis, which I talked to you about, where we look at one chemical at a time, but we also have really sophisticated methods now where we could look at mixtures of chemicals. So we looked at the compound of 4 of these PFAS together and what effect they have on the human body. So when we looked at single chemical analysis, we found that among children and adolescents, PFAS, PFOA, PFOS, and PFHXS was associated with a higher risk of common cold in children. And one of those compounds was associated with a higher risk in adolescents as well. But even more importantly is the effect that we found among children of the complex mixture. So this is a little hard to read because it's very mathematical and scientific-y, but basically what you have to look at here, if you could see my arrow, is this upward trend of increasing quartiles of concentration of the total mixture of these 4 chemicals and a higher risk of common cold among children between 3 and 11 years of age. So for every quantile increase across this distribution of exposure, we found a higher risk among children of common cold. Now, it may seem sort of trivial, common cold, but common cold is an indicator of your immune status. And we know through animal studies and other studies that we've conducted since that these children have lower antibody response to vaccines that they've been exposed to. So they have a lower response to producing antibodies if they have higher levels of PFAS in them. And now you know that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're at a chronic stage, but our immune systems are being taxed by PFAS. And how we respond to the COVID vaccine or the flu vaccine or the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine is impacted by how much PFAS we have in our bodies. And so this is something that we need to be very concerned about, not just the reproductive effects, but how these chemicals impact our children's health, their ability to fight infection, and then as adults as well, our ability to fight infection. So this study was focused on children. But I want to give you some more good news now because it's not all negative. It is. There's lots of effects, but there are some things that we could look at that potentially can modify our burden on our bodies. And so Yu Zhang and colleagues from URI, the University of Rhode Island, thanks to Superfund funding for PFAS with the University of Rhode Island, Harvard Chan School of Public Health, one of the PIs, Angela Slitt, and I were discussing over coffee during the pandemic on how we might be able to look at dietary interventions for PFAS. And we had some findings from her study, some animal studies that showed that pure fruit juice consumption in her work showed that the animals had lower PFAS in their body. So when she looked at tissue of these animals, those that she fed pure fruit juice had lower concentrations in their body. So I'll show you that figure right here. They had lower PFAS in the treatment group compared to the control group. And so that made us curious about the finding. And so Zhang again went back and looked at the NHANES data to see whether or not we could find any evidence of nutrients being able to modify the association between PFAS and the relationship between PFAS and this nutrient. So looking at a host of different types of dietary nutrient consumption or reported intake of supplements, we report and have findings that show very strong effects between folate levels that are measured in your blood and reduced biomarker concentrations of all 4 PFAS that we looked at. So in this figure or this table, we look at the percent change in serum PFAS concentrations as a result of about a 3-fold increase in red blood cell folate concentration. So to translate that, higher levels of folate in your blood reduced the levels of PFAS in your blood by 12 to about 30%, depending on which conjugate or which compound we looked at. And this was true for adults, and it was also true as well for adolescents. So we asked the question, can certain nutrients reduce PFAS concentrations in our blood? And we found yes for adolescents for PFAS and PFNA, and yes for adults across all 4 of these PFAS that we examined using NHANES data. We also looked at, this paper is under review, whether or not among teenagers can higher or lower levels of folate change the effect that we see between PFAS and the immune function that I mentioned earlier. So when we looked at a stratified analysis, looking at those adolescents that had low folate in their blood compared to those adolescents that had high folate in their blood, that we only found the immune altering effects of PFAS among the adolescents that had lower concentrations of folate in their bodies. So I'm going to look at the time. I don't know if I have time to go through. Do I have time to go through some different, I was going to look at disinfection byproducts very briefly, if that's okay. A different class of chemicals, but nevertheless, also very important that I think are ones that we need to target while we're targeting PFAS. We can't work one chemical at a time or one class of chemicals at a time. We need to have policies that allow healthy water, safe drinking water. A lot of attention's been paid to PFAS. They deserve and merit attention because we need to understand them more, and we know that they're harmful and they're forever chemicals, but our water has many things in it, and it's not just PFAS. And so I think regulating and understanding the impact of these other chemicals as well could be very important. So if I have a few more minutes, I would love to share with you some of the work that we've done on disinfection byproducts, which are very understudied and not recognized in Massachusetts as much as they should be in the US. So I will go back to sharing my screen, if that's all right.
Yep, that's fine.
Yep. So yeah, disinfection byproducts. I'll tell you a little bit more about those. So we can measure these disinfection byproducts in our blood and urine, trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids. How does this happen? How do we get these chemicals in our water? So when we go to chlorinate the water in the municipal system, we add chlorine because it makes water safe. It gets rid of bacteria. It helps keep water from making us sick. It's how we've been able to increase life expectancy across the globe through disinfecting water. It's very important, but it needs to be very carefully done because the byproducts that are formed when chlorine reacts with organic matter in the water, thousands of species, what we call disinfection byproducts, get formed. Trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids, the 2 that I mentioned, are the most abundant species that we detect in the water supply system that has been put through municipal treatment. But these chemicals harm human health. I've published with my colleagues in the SEED program using NHANES data and a very well-conducted study in China that measured extensively these chemicals in a cohort, that these disinfection byproducts are associated with all-cause mortality, oxidative stress, birth outcomes, neurodevelopmental outcomes, fetal growth, reduced fetal growth. New papers that we just published in the last year on asthma in children and adolescents, this is NHANES data, thyroid function, this is NHANES data, this is American data, lung function, allergic sensitization, and now we have new findings that we have under review on some other effects on osteoarthritis and other inflammatory effects. So here's a study that I'm going to actually go to this one, which is looking at haloacetic acids and disinfection which is a disinfection byproduct in small for gestational age. So if you're born small for gestation age, you have risk factors across life for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, a whole host of it, adverse health that can happen across time. It's not just that you're born small when you're at birth, but this impacts your health across time and is associated with premature mortality. We also show that it's associated with oxidative stress. Higher levels of oxidative stress causes DNA damage. These are all published papers, recent papers. I'll skip over this one. I'm going to go to this NHANES one. Looked at NHANES data across many cycles in the United States, and we found that these chemicals were associated with all-cause mortality. Americans are dying prematurely as a result of being more highly exposed to these chemicals. So T3 is the most highly exposed group. We show that they're at higher risk of dying prematurely, of cancer-caused mortality and non-cancer related deaths. Thyroid function, as we know, is something that affects a large number of our population. These disinfection byproducts result in thyroid dysfunction in Americans and cause adolescents and children to be at higher risk of asthma. Also very important outcome that affects and costs our society billions of dollars in treatment across time. I just want to end with some of the educational resources that we have on our website. We produced a number of pamphlets and educational material that we are also translating into Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese, among other languages, to make them accessible to Americans. You could download them for free off our website if you click on this resource button. Lastly, I want to end with, these are our resources, a whole host of them. I want to just end with something that's really important. We need to focus on a more integrated model of how we address these issues. So early life exposure is where I started this talk, talking about how a pregnant woman today and what she's exposed to and what her partner is exposed to before they conceive that pregnancy will impact her baby and her eggs in that baby, which then form her grandchild, and how that has an impact across life for that mother, but for her grandchild as well. And these effects we can measure in childhood, in adolescenthood, in reproductive health, all the way for women to menopause and beyond, and for men as well. We need to look at prevention through policy, mitigation measures, clean water acts, and we need to have early interventions to identify those that are most at risk. And we need to build an integrative model that allows us to look at the natural, built, and social environment. So I know we mentioned incarceration and the criminal system. That's a social environment. It doesn't occur in isolation from the built and natural environments, which is what District Attorney Ryan had said, that these things do not occur in isolation. These are compound effects, and we need to work on all three types of environments to actually make a difference. So I urge you to consider an integrated model when you try to address these issues, and I'm here to answer questions. And you can find me on Instagram, on Harvard's website, and you can send me an email at any time with questions. I'm here to support Massachusetts legislation in support of, I have 2 children in the Brookline system. I rent a house. I can't afford a water filtration system because my landlord, I have a filtration system. My landlord won't let me install it because it requires special changes to my kitchen. And so I drink tap water that's not filtered. And my older son, who's very educated in this matter, talks to me about it every day. And I'm a scientist and can't change my own home's water. So imagine someone who's a white privileged woman who's a Harvard professor that studies this stuff, has a limitation being able to offer clean water to her kids. Imagine individuals across this country that have no resources, no education, no ability to change what they're exposed to by things that they can do day to day. We need top-down approaches that are led by people like ourselves, but we also need to empower people to know and to make choices, but also advocate for better in their communities. I think we need both top-down and bottom-up approaches to really solve this from a much more integrated perspective. And so that's it for me. Thank you so much for giving me the floor. And I think I made it on time. I'm very proud of myself.
Doctor, thank you. Thank you so much for getting us started this morning. We're going to collect some questions and we'll come back to you with those questions.
Yep.
But at this point, it is my great honor to welcome Senator Ed Markey, really a champion in this area. His voice calling for climate change to be addressed both with urgency and equity has really inspired literally generations of activists, particularly among young people. He has said, and I think this sums up where we are today, skin color, neighborhood, or net worth should never determine access to clean and safe drinking water. We can eradicate the environmental contaminants of the 20th century by investing in infrastructure for the 21st century. Every community deserves to be free of lead and other drinking water contaminants that threaten public health. And it is for Senator Markey, not just words, but even before his election to the United States Senate in 2013, Senator Markey served in the House of Representatives for 37 years. He was the dean of the Massachusetts delegation. He was the ranking member of the chair of the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming, and the senior member of Energy and Commerce, the Energy and Commerce Committee. And he has used those positions to really make messages in for the country in this area. In 2009, as a congressman, he was the co-author of the landmark American Clean Energy and Security Act. That was then, and think about that, was not that long ago. It was then the only comprehensive climate legislation that had ever passed a chamber of Congress. We all know that in 2019, he was Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to introduce the Green New Deal, a resolution aimed at creating jobs, renewable energy, counteracting systemic injustices, and addressing the threat of climate change. Again, in 2019, Senator Markey introduced water safety legislation titled the Contaminant and Lead Electronic Accounting and Reporting Requirements, the Clear Drinking Water Act, that authorized more than $1 billion in federal funding to help small and disadvantaged communities replace their contaminated water infrastructure to comply with the Safe Drinking Water Act. He's been instrumental in securing the $5 billion of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law to support grant funding, which we'll talk about today, for small and historically disadvantaged communities dealing with PFAS contamination in the drinking water. You know, I've said often of Senator Markey, real leaders see a problem, they craft solutions, they put it in place, and then they lead the rest of us to where they are. Senator Markey's been leading on this issue literally for decades, and it is only recently that others have come to recognize the wisdom of his words. So it really is my great personal and professional honor and pleasure to welcome him to our summit today. Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you. And thank you, District Attorney Ryan, for focusing on this issue, for taking your office and using it as a way of targeting this issue for the attention of all communities across the Commonwealth, not just Middlesex County, but everywhere, because this is an issue of justice, racial justice, environmental justice, but ultimately, you know, economic justice as well, because of the impacts that these chemicals have upon people's lives. So I thank you so much for your great leadership and taking this issue and really helping to elevate it today into a summit that allows us to look at environmental justice and water safety issues. and to focus on the urgent issue of PFAS contamination in our water. Everyone should have a right to clean water. I'm here in Malden right now, 3 blocks from the Malden River. When I was a boy, my mother would say to me, Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River. And the reason was that it was black with a kind of pre-Jimi Hendrix purple haze that was over it. And that was all of the chemical companies, all along, all of the coal companies. Converse Rubber made every Converse All-Star on the Malden River, 3 blocks from where I am right now. And they just used the Malden River as a dumping ground. And my mother was telling me when I was 10, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River. And that was pretty clear that I was not Tom Sawyer on the Mississippi, that I'm here in a blue-collar community with the Malden River being used as a dumping ground. So when I went to Congress, I fought to clean up the hazardous waste dumps that were poisoning the air and the water for children along these rivers and throughout the Commonwealth. In Woburn, for example, Ann Anderson came into my office in 1979 with her son Jimmy, and she said that Jimmy had leukemia, but she had found a number of other children in her neighborhood with leukemia, but she wasn't getting any cooperation from the city government at all. Would I help her? So I was able to work with the EPA to bring in resources, and ultimately that became the movie A Civil Action that dealt with the cleanup of the Woburn hazardous waste site. And on it now is a huge development and a transportation center, and it's called the Jimmy Anderson Transportation Center because Jimmy died when he was 12. So it's in memory of him. And it just shows that if you identify and you're honest about these issues and the impact it has upon the most vulnerable, especially children, that something can be done about it. So we cleaned up those dumps, we delivered for those kids, but we just have to continue. We have to continue to fight. And so I have, as District Attorney Ryan said, I've advocated for a healthy environment and to make sure that we have safe water, healthy, clean air for everyone. I've fought for clean water protections. I've fought against any efforts to roll back the progress that we have made. And just yesterday, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. But we know that there's more work to do to ensure that we safeguard our communities, our waterways, and our planet by guaranteeing safe, clean waters free from industrial pollution and forever chemicals. As Rachel Carson wrote in Silent Spring, as crude a weapon as the caveman's club, the chemical barrage has been hurled against the fabric of life. A fabric, on the one hand, delicate and destructible, on the other, miraculously tough and resilient and capable of striking back in unexpected ways. Sadly, when it has come to PFAS, we've learned more and more about the destructive effects of this chemical barrage. So now it is time to strike back. I've urged the EPA to use all of its authorities to address PFAS, and they are taking action. In April, the EPA moved to use the Clean Water Act to prevent polluters from dumping more PFAS into our environment. In August, EPA took the historic step of proposing that 2 types of PFAS should be designated as hazardous substances under the Superfund law. That's the same law that I fought to pass for Ann Anderson and Jimmy Anderson. That's now our Constitution, the Superfund law. And that change that we're now making would increase transparency, hold polluters even more accountable. But the forever nature of these chemicals means that even as we move away from putting more in the environment, we need to actively work to clean up what's already there. 70% of communities have detectable levels of PFAS in the groundwater and rivers. Clearly, we have a big problem because right now, 20% of public water sources in Massachusetts have drinking water contaminated with unacceptable levels of the 6 most dangerous forever chemicals. That means 20% of children and their growing bodies are being exposed to chemicals, and that can disrupt their growth. That's 20% of families hoping to have children being exposed to chemicals that disrupt reproductive health. That's 20% of our Commonwealth being exposed to an increased risk of cancer. It's our duty to fix this. We need to clean up our water. And thankfully, towns across Massachusetts are working hard and finding innovative solutions to pay for PFAS remediation and protect their residents. Natick is planning to spend $3 million on a high-tech carbon filtration system. Littleton has invested $20 million in a PFAS remediation plan. Wayland has been spending $20,000 every single week on bottled water to replace its contaminated wells. And Cambridge recently switched its water source as it installs a new filter at its water treatment facility. In Congress, I've been fighting to support the hard work being done at the state and local level to protect people in their homes. Last year, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure law and secured historic investments in our future. And that funding, and we passed it just a year ago, that funding included $10 billion in new funding specifically to get PFAS out of our water systems. Clean drinking water is a matter of justice. This year, we also passed the historic Inflation Reduction Act just 2 months ago, which was something that included key investments to advance environmental justice, including funding for my Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. I did that with Congresswoman Cori Bush from St. Louis. And this tracking and monitoring tool will be key in ensuring that 40% of investments for a clean, PFAS-free, and climate-safe future goes to communities and neighborhoods that have been harmed by racist and unjust environmental practices. So that's key, $369 billion, but it is written in a way in which 40% of the money is going to go to those communities, those neighborhoods that have been harmed by racist and unjust environmental practices. That was the larger goal that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I had in introducing the Green New Deal. It was to ensure that we put it out there very clearly that there have been communities that have been left behind for years. And now in this new bill, it's specific, it's intentional. 40% of the money has to go to those communities. Now, we have a lot more work to do to protect our friends and our neighbors across Massachusetts and across the country. But I know that with leadership like that, which is being provided by District Attorney Ryan and all of these great leaders who are going to be presenting today, and everyone who is on this call, that we're going to make sure that there's clean drinking water for every single community and every single person, regardless of race or income, inside of the state of Massachusetts. We have to stop these chemicals at their source, and we need better testing, better remediation, and funding for these communities, because only then will these forever chemicals become never chemicals. So thank you for coming together for this important summit, and thank you for being just such great partners in this fight. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, Senator. I think we have time for a couple of questions. If people have a question for Senator Markey. I think it's really an expression of people's gratitude, really, just Senator, with especially for your leadership and also for the, which we're hoping to talk about today in terms of how communities can best use that fund to address these issues in their community. Are there other things, Senator, that you think on a federal level we should be looking to or planning to increase in terms of addressing particularly the PFAS contaminants?
Well, this funding, and it is important for the Commonwealth and for communities to understand that that this package, as I said, it has $10 billion in it, and Massachusetts can, in fact, qualify for huge amounts of this money. So there's $1 billion in the bill for clean water state revolving fund and that's for wastewater systems where PFAS can be. And then there's another $4 billion for PFAS drinking water state revolving fund, and that just means that where there are drinking water systems that they can apply for the funding, and $5 billion for PFAS in small and disadvantaged communities. So those are the communities that have historically been overlooked. So right now, Massachusetts is set to receive $17.5 million for PFAS in drinking water, $3 million for PFAS in wastewater, and $100 million in general drinking and clean water revolving fund money, which can go towards PFAS remediation. So that's about $120 million that Massachusetts is going to have coming our way. And we've heard from the State Department of Environmental Protection that Massachusetts has submitted a letter of intent to participate in the grant program for small and disadvantaged communities, the communities that have always been left behind. And I was actually able to secure a key change in the law that allows assistance for small and disadvantaged communities to also go towards point source filters as a stopgap measure for cleaning up contaminated water. These funds are going to be critical to help states and cities and towns to clean the water of PFAS at the source. We need to remove PFAS at the water processing plants because filtration can help protect health quickly. It can be a key in many communities, but we cannot default to people installing filtration systems at their homes. We just heard that from the professor. That makes low-income and renting people more at risk for PFAS exposure. We owe everyone clean water.
Senator, one of the groups that, in addition to fighting in Congress to get that money, you have spent so much time talking to young people about these issues and really help them to harness the energy and the passion they have for climate change, for protection of our earth. What kind of an impact do you think that those young voices speaking out on these issues?
I think young people have been the difference. I think that the Green New Deal, which I introduced with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I think the Sunrise Movement, which is young people all across the country who have raised their voices demanding environmental justice, have made all the difference. There's a reason why all these bills over the last 2 years have focused on environmental justice, have focused upon communities of color, have focused upon those who are most at risk. And it's largely because of the leadership of young people who have come into the political process, highlighted these issues, elevated them dramatically. And now we can see what the result is in public policy. Politicians in Washington decided ultimately that they had to respond to those young people. Congress is a stimulus response institution, and there's nothing more stimulating than millions of young people raising their voices and saying that this is a critical issue for them. So I do believe, I agree with you, District Attorney Ryan, that this is an issue that is generational. In the same way that climate change is an issue created by generations before, so too is this PFAS issue. And young people are saying that they were let down and they want these problems to be solved now.
What do you think, Senator, and this is, obviously I'm a prosecutor and I think about following the evidence and who do we hold accountable? You played an enormous role in holding BP accountable for the spill. Do you think there is a path for holding the sources of some of these PFAS contaminants accountable?
Absolutely. I think that in the same way, that the opioid companies ultimately have now been made liable, in the same way that we made the companies liable who dumped into the Abidjona River in Woburn that ultimately caused cancers in those young people. We definitely are going to have a line of legal liability that runs right to those companies who left these chemicals in our water, in our land, and ultimately they were transmitted into the bodies of young people and pregnant women all across the Commonwealth and all across the country. So I agree with you that there's going to be a strong legal theory that ultimately will go right at all of these companies who have acted irresponsibly. If my mother knew enough to say to me when I was 10 years old, don't swim in the Malden River, because she could see what was going on with that river, are we supposed to believe that the CEOs of those companies didn't know that they were using the Malden River as a sewer? Are we supposed to believe that they didn't have scientists at these chemical companies, these coal companies, these the rubber companies with regard to what the impact was going to be on human beings? Of course. So we just have to be aggressive, ensure that we target them and use all of the governmental resources we have to make these companies accountable, because we know that when there's an example set and some corporation pays a price, that other corporations take notice, because now their shareholders will be holding them accountable for their nefarious activities. So yes, I do agree very
Senator,
strongly.
if we could, before you go, Senator, before you go, I know Dr. Allen, the president of the Mass Medical Society, who I know you know, is raising her hand. If we can have her question. Carol, do you have a question?
Thank you very much, District Attorney. And I'm the immediate past president now of the Medical Society. As you know, Senator, I care a lot about children, and this is a clarifying question. When you talked about justice mapping, tracking, and mapping and tracking monitoring, is it only for PFAS, or, some things are more prevalent and affect children in different ways. So I'm thinking about lead. When my pediatric colleague, Mona Hanna-Tisha, discovered lead poisoning in Flint, it was because she saw patients with high lead levels. So that's kind of late in the game to find the problem. Is the mapping just for PFAS, which is very important, but are we also monitoring for lead and other kinds of contaminants that affect children, maybe earlier, may show up earlier in infancy, for example? Thank
Yeah,
you. Thanks for
thank
all
you.
your efforts.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Dr. Allen. And Dr. Allen has come to my office every year for decades to tell me what my assignment is, and especially to protect children. She is a pediatrician, so it is so good to see you again. No, it's not just for PFAS. It's all of these pollutants, which have an impact on families, and that's what Congresswoman Bush and I intend. It's to enable a detailed community level data collection that will help us to understand and tackle the problems of environmental racism. And that high quality data allows us to connect people and their communities with the tangible policy solutions and the investments needed to fully address environmental racism. So no, it's funding that would be used to track all of the environmental injustice in the country. Because if you don't map it, you can't solve the problem. And Massachusetts is going to get $65 million for remediation this year, but there's a lot more to be done. And the bills that we passed have a lot more money in it. But I felt that not just PFAS, but all of these chemicals have to be identified. Then actually more pressure will be created to put even more funding in the bill in order to remove them from the air, the water, and the land that we live with. Thank you so much, Doctor. You and your team have always been just cutting edge for the whole nation. Thank you.
Senator, I join with the Sierra Club members who are here today, so many others in the chat, in thanking you for your leadership, for the actual product that you gained for all of us, and for joining us here today. Thank you. We are grateful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, District Attorney Ryan. Thank you. Thanks for your incredible work. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. All right. We are going to move to back Dr. Messerlian. There are a couple of questions in the chat for her, Doctor. And I apologize that we had to switch off to the senator so he could get back to other things. But one question is there funding for increased research on the impact of other chemicals? This is similar to Dr. Allen's question. In your work on the reproductive and childhood piece, are you looking at other things in addition to PFAS?
Well, the NIH is the main funding body for research in the country. So we have our federal funds that are usually, set at a certain level for this type of work. I think PFAS and other chemicals have gotten some good attention. I think there's need for more money to come in to fund people like myself that are motivated to do this type of work. What we really need to also do, which is an area that I'm exploring, is actually work on interventions and measure and evaluate those interventions to see if they work. So can we put children on diets for several weeks or change exposure levels through supplements like folic acid supplementation, see if we can measure change in concentrations in children, adolescents, adults, and look at whether or not we see differences in outcomes when we modify diet to potentially reduce how much chemicals we find in our bodies. So those kinds of studies have not been funded, but are in really high need, in my view, as someone working in this space for 15 plus years.
Now, Doctor, you talked about the concern that you have about disinfection by products. What alternatives exist for disinfection of a large water supply?
So a couple of things that concerned me over the course of the pandemic was a heightened concern over the water and its the potential for the virus to be transmitted through water. We in fact measured some factors in water to be able to detect the spikes in how many people are exposed and experiencing COVID in a community, and that's one of the sentinel signs that we use. So there is a way to disinfect the water without, setting really strict limits on what's safe, I think is where we start, and filtering and using systems that can reduce after you do the filtration, after you do the disinfection, to reduce the species that we're exposed to. So it's, it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just one thing, keeping a very tight, and another part is, the individuals that are running these plants are people that are just doing their job, and a little bit more of a specific chemical, a chlorine chemical in that particular reservoir at that particular time could cause a stillbirth, a miscarriage, a baby that's born defected, a baby that has a lifelong complication. I mean, 1 week of disinfection where someone measures it wrong and does the wrong calculation for how much to disinfect, or thinks, there's COVID, let's disinfect the water more, does not know the impact of a slight increase and how many people are exposed and when in time they're exposed. So a woman who just got pregnant and is or about to conceive a pregnancy, and how that can impact her chances of having a healthy baby. Sperm parameters and other things could be impacted. And over time, chronic exposure increases our risk of cancer and other, thyroid disease, asthma for children, a whole host of disease endpoints. So we need to think about the population, the strategies of preventive medicine talks about reducing the mean concentration of something. So we can go down a little bit, it changes the entire distribution down. So setting the limits and lowering the limits even by a little bit enhances and changes the whole distribution across the population. And that type of approach is what we need. Thinking about the big picture, but also the small picture.
Thank you, Doctor. I was particularly struck by your story about your inability to put in the filtration system. Looking at, for instance, the Cambridge problem and the inequity that will be posed by a point of source filter, which at $300 or so is very affordable for some and completely out of the reach of others. So thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for being here and for being so patient with us. And we will forward you some more questions because we have lots more. Yep. Thank you.
I'll be on. Thanks.
All right, we are going to turn now and welcome Dr. Kristi Pullen Fedinick, who is a public health scientist with over 25 years of multidisciplinary research experience. And Dr. Fedinick currently serves as the executive director of the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy based in Minneapolis. And that center's mission is dedicated to ensuring that communities and policymakers have all the tools and the information they need to create just, sustainable energy and environmental policies with a focus on environmental justice. For the past decade, she's been working right there at that intersection of science and public policy, trying to advance the idea of data-driven, health protective, and community-oriented. And that's a lot to think about in terms of policy solutions. Her work is focused in particular on using scientific tools and data visualization to advance the protection of people and communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation. She previously served as the Chief Science Officer of the National Resources Defense Council, where she worked for almost 9 years and led the development of that same sort of equity-based approach. She holds a part-time faculty position in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the Millikan Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. She has written multiple policy reports and peer review articles that serves on a number of committees, including the EPA Science Advisory Board. Her research, including that report that I talked about earlier, the Watered Down Justice Report, and a publication on the lead crisis, what we just heard Dr. Allen talking about in Flint, really shone a bright light on the racial and socioeconomic implications of whether you get access to safe water and the broader problems that can pose. Dr. Fedinick received her bachelor's degree in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Maryland at the Baltimore County, and her PhD in molecular and cell biology from UC Berkeley. She was also a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Historical Health and Society Scholar at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. She really brings that deep experience, and specifically with regard to this, her commitment to not telling people what to do, but working alongside communities in the front line in this crisis, and thinking about how do we try to address the crisis and do it in a fair and proportionate way. I'm so grateful to have you with us today, Doctor. We look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, District Attorney Ryan. It's so wonderful to be here. There's so many questions that came up in the last section that I want to talk about: disinfection byproducts and lead. We could have a whole symposium on that too, and even just talking about the limitations of the Safe Drinking Water Act, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. But I'll share my screen, and so I'm really going to stay at the pretty high level today. Let me share. And are you seeing the presentation? The PowerPoint? Okay, not presenter view. Perfect. Okay, great. So, I'm going to talk today about supporting water justice with community-centered data. A lot of this work was work that I did during my time at the Natural Resources Defense Council, but the principles really apply across a number of areas. I'm going to be focusing on drinking water today, and I'm going to talk a bit about lead because it's something that is pervasive and really illustrative of some of the weaknesses that exist within the Safe Drinking Water Act and how we think about not only violations to the law itself, but how we can utilize enforcement tools in order to correct the issues that we know to exist in communities across the country. But this also applies to energy justice and environmental justice topics much more broadly. So a lot of the tools I'll discuss today are broadly applicable, and I'm just excited to be here to talk with all of you about some of these issues. And so, just again, very high level, drinking water violations are quite pervasive. And so this was looking at data from 2016 to 2019. There were 130 million people in the United States that were served by drinking water systems that violated the Safe Drinking Water Act. Now, when we're talking about violations, again, just to piggyback a little bit on the discussion earlier about disinfection byproducts, even though there are multiple methods of disinfection that a water system can use, you can use chlorination, you can use chloramination, you can use ozonation. There are all of these different chemistries that you can utilize in order to disinfect water. Only 8 byproducts are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, even though we know that there could be thousands that could occur as a function of the different types of disinfection that a particular system might use. And so while we know that 130 million people at that time, and I'll talk a bit about some more recent numbers shortly, were served by drinking water systems that had violations, this isn't talking about the totality of the number of people that are exposed to potentially harmful chemicals in their water at any given time. And again, I'll use lead as an illustration of this really shortly, but just to give you a sense of about 40% of the population is exposed to or potentially exposed to chemicals due to violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And as we already heard, drinking water violations can be impactful to our health. So we know a number of health effects that are regulated or thought about and targeted in regulation through the Safe Drinking Water Act. So cancer, developmental effects, which you've talked a lot about and learned a lot about today already, gastrointestinal distress and disease, nervous system impacts. And there are different rules under the Safe Drinking Water Act that cover these various endpoints or regulate chemicals that are known to interact with or lead to the causation of some of these different health effects. So the regulation of drinking water is really critical. And, we only regulate, depending on how you count the disinfection byproducts, about 109 chemicals under the Safe Drinking Water Act, even though we know, for example, under TSCA, there are, 65 to 120,000, the Toxic Substances Control Act, 65 to, 100,000 chemicals that we know to exist just as their dedicated chemistry, not including, the byproducts that might occur as they degrade in our bodies or in soils or in the environment. And so again, even though we're looking at these big health effects, we're not necessarily even capturing the totality of the chemicals that could be causing these impacts, including PFAS. And so something else we know about the Safe Drinking Water Act is that enforcement actions against water violations are weak. And so this is looking again at data, this was in 2016, where we looked at the total number of violations that occurred to this federal law, that there were 80,000, for example, for any type of violation. There are 80,000 violations for any kind of contamination or any type of reporting or monitoring event. And it's also important to look at some of those distinctions. But we found that very few of the enforcement actions that were taken involved a penalty. And so, oftentimes this is all carrot and no stick. We really, aren't necessarily compelling or forcing the water systems to come into compliance in ways that will actually be protective of human health. We also see very similar types of numbers when we look on the right at the formal enforcement actions taken for health-based violations. So these are the violations that we know that, again, could lead to some of those health impacts that I talked about in the earlier slide. And of the 12,000 violations, over 12,000 violations we saw for health-based contamination, we saw that only 813 had any type of violation with a penalty assessed in order to enforce the change in that action. Now, we know oftentimes that these violations occur in very small systems. So systems that serve less than 500 people, for example, are much more likely to have violations than systems that serve over 100,000 people. And a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the Safe Drinking Water Act, I mean, there are bad actors that have occurred. We saw that occur in Flint, but oftentimes there are technical, managerial, or financial issues that prevent or prohibit in some ways small systems from being able to act on contamination that either they, one, know exists and don't have the ability to remediate it, or two, don't have the capacity to even determine whether or not the contamination exists in the first place. And so, really understanding that the burden for fixing a lot of these problems falls on very small systems across the country. But some of the other things that we found in looking at just overall drinking water contamination, this is not looking at race or income or any other kind of demographic information. We found that of the 80,000 reported safe drinking water violations, that there were some places that were hit harder than others. So when we looked at the top 5 states with Safe Drinking Water Act violations, Texas by population had the largest number of people served by drinking water systems that were in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act, with 12 million people down to 3 million people in Georgia. But one of the very striking things we found, and this was in our report Threats on Tap in 2017, that 99.5% of the population in Puerto Rico was in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so when you think about those numbers, that you can have nearly 100% of a population that's impacted by violations to this bedrock environmental law, that you really start to get into questions of colonialization and what it means for our for folks that are living in Puerto Rico that don't have the same rights within our country that we have within the within our continental United States, and really trying to help us understand that who is being impacted by these drinking water violations is not necessarily equally distributed across the entirety of our country. And so the initial thing that brought me into doing this work, honestly, was I had started doing some drinking water investigations during my time before I joined NRDC. I was at a smaller nonprofit in the Midwest, looking at drinking water violations within Region 5 of EPA. And at the time, there wasn't an extensive database that existed for even looking at drinking water violations. So I began to play around with data and create my own database. But once I had moved to NRDC, I had been working on the Toxic Substances Control Act and utilizing computational biology methods to evaluate chemicals that can harm people and animals and ecosystems using high throughput tools. But Flint came into the national consciousness. And at the time, the people of Flint had been experiencing issues with their drinking water, and those issues and those concerns had gone largely, unrecognized by the folks in power to affect change and to improve the situation that they were experiencing. And so, when Flint hit the national consciousness, I wanted to also understand whether or not there could be other potential Flints out there. And so what we found in 2015, and this is at the height of the Flint crisis, just to keep that in mind, mind, there were 18 million people served by drinking water systems that had lead violations. And so there were over 5,000 community water systems. You can see that, Massachusetts is well represented on this map. Over 8,000 violations to the lead and copper rule. We also found that there were 600,000 people served by 214 water systems with health-based violations to the lead and copper rule as well. And so this is a large number of people that are impacted by lead in their drinking water, again, at the height of the Flint crisis. But one of the striking things that we found in the database was that 0 violations were reported for Flint at the time. This is at the height of the poisoning of people in Flint, and no violations to the lead and copper rule had been reported in the database. And so when we think about data-centered approaches, we need to rely not only on the information that's in the databases that are available to us, but also the information that's coming from the expertise of communities and lived experiences. And so oftentimes, again, when we think about data-centric approaches, it's really about the numbers and the quantification and the quantitation of the impacts that may be happening to specific communities. But the data can be missing really key things that could leave people behind. And oftentimes our data structures are set up in ways that don't count and don't see and don't bring to light the experiences that communities are facing around the country. And so, this is, again, using lead as an illustration, when we look at the, violations to the lead and copper rule that's triggered, so there are multiple ways in which the lead and copper rule can trigger a violation. It's usually when a water system doesn't do the type of work it needs to do in order to prevent lead from contaminating the water in the first place. It isn't actually based on the amount of lead that's in the water. So you can have another trigger that creates the impetus for a water system to be able to clean up and try to reduce the amount of lead within its particular system. And that trigger is at 15 parts per billion. So just really making sure that folks in the audience also understand that there's no safe amount of lead. So 15 parts per billion of lead is not safe. It's just the thing that says that the drinking water system needs to clean up its act and reduce the amount of lead in the water. And if we look at this level, 15 parts per billion, we can see that 7 million people, and this was in 2019, were served by drinking water systems that exceeded 15 parts per billion. And if we were going back to that lead example for Flint not being in the database, these are the types of data that we're talking about, and Flint would have been missed in this particular situation. But if we take that level down to 5 parts per billion, which is what the FDA recommends for bottled water, again, no safe amount of lead, we can see that there's 61 million people that are served by water systems that have, above 5 parts per billion in their water. So the law itself doesn't trigger any action at all at this level, though. So there are people that are falling through the cracks, again, because the amounts of lead that are in their water aren't even necessarily looked at under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And finally, if we look at the level that is set by or recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics to be more protective of, especially child health, at 1 part per billion, 186 million people are served by drinking water systems that have over 1 part per billion of lead in their water. And so the stark differences between that 15 parts per billion, which is what triggers an action again on the legal side for a drinking water system, and 1 parts per billion is staggering. And so again, we don't want to rely just on the data that are available to us in the ways in which, say, the policy may be set up for us to think about, but to really interrogate and look at information from all sources in order to determine and identify communities that are most vulnerable. And so that 186 million people, again, gets us to even more of our population that's exposed to lead. But again, what we've seen from the Puerto Rico example, from the Flint example, is that not all of these violations are occurring in the same populations at the same rate. And so even though we often, when we think about, the relationships between race and drinking water, for example, our mind tends to go back to Jim Crow segregation, and images of, colored fountains and white fountains and people not being able to receive access to drinking water in very visible ways, that even though we don't see the same images, in our daily lives, the differences between the haves and the have-nots, based upon race and income still remain. And so in Watered Down Justice, which I'm excited that you all, will have in your materials after this meeting, focused on and really looked at the relationships between race, income, and other social vulnerability indications and indicators to determine whether or not there was a relationship between violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act and these different sociodemographic indicators. And what we found is that drinking water violations are not randomly distributed. So the violations to the Safe Drinking Water Act were statistically related to socioeconomic status, to housing and transportation, and to minority status and language. And we found that the minority status and language variable had the strongest relationship of all the variables that we looked at. And again, if we're looking at the county level, which is a crude estimate of being able to look at drinking water systems in the country, because our drinking water systems are sub-county level typically, it's to be able to find a relationship at that level was actually quite striking. I didn't think that we would see any kind of relationship that would exist, across all of these variables, but being able to see that even with relatively crude metrics also demonstrates the severity of the problem. And so we found that race and place mattered for all drinking water violations. So this is a map of the country that looks at the relationship between race on one axis, on the so drinking water violations are on the y-axis. We have increasing populations of color on the x-axis, and we can identify hotspots around the country where we have increased, higher proportions of the population that are people of color, and highest proportions of our highest levels of drinking water violations relative to other parts of the country. And again, we can see some of that occurring in the Northeast, and I'll talk about Massachusetts in just a second. We can also see that race and place mattered for enforcement. And so we found that that communities that had higher, or counties that had higher proportions of their populations that were people of color, tended to be in violation longer, to have more chemical contaminants within their water. And even when enforcement actions were taken, were slower to come back into compliance than other counties with different demographic features. And we also know that race and place matters for PFAS. And so I, didn't participate in the study, but this was done by some of my colleagues at NRDC that use similar methods to what I did in Watered Down Justice, that looked at the relationships between race and place for PFAS, and found in California that, of the top 10 systems, for example, that had PFAS detections, that many of them had, high levels, high percentages of the population that are people of color, less than a high school education, high percentages of the population with unemployment, high percentages of the population in poverty, above the California average. And so when we're, again, thinking about ways in which we're going to remediate and fix problems, being able to focus on the groups that are most in need, not only of remediation of drinking water issues, but larger social remediation as well, is really critical. And so while we want to be able to have perfect systems to detect the amount of PFAS in every system around the country, we know where the communities are that are most in need of help. And so beginning to work on creating and installing, the filtration systems that we need to install in order to ensure that not only PFAS, but other contaminants are removed from the water, can be really critical. And so I also wanted to, close out, and when I have some recommendations in just a second, but to think also about what this means for Massachusetts. And so this is, taking the map of just Massachusetts from the Watered Down Justice Report, and you can see that there are, there's a pretty wide distribution actually of, within this choropleth of, counties within the Commonwealth that have, large numbers of violations or a smaller number of violations, and and the distinction correlation between places with higher percentages of the population that are people of color and those violations. And this really seems as though it's representative of the country in a lot of ways, which was really quite surprising. But if we look at some of the more specific demographic indicators, so the yellow census tracts that you're seeing in this top map are places or census tracts within the Commonwealth that have 50% or more of their population that are people of color. And so you can see that there are lots of areas within the Commonwealth that could be targeted for immediate assistance in the allocation of those funds that Senator Markey talked about. And if also we look at income as well, you can see again in the western part of the state where there were large numbers of violations, but not the highest percentiles of people of color relative to the rest of the country, that income also seems to play an important factor in the Commonwealth as well. And so really ensuring that, as you're allocating funds and working at the state level in particular, where, the EJA or the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act monies are going to be passed through to communities that are most in need, that you utilize tools in order to identify the communities that to be impacted, not only by drinking water, but other issues as well. And, so finally, impacted communities really deserve change. We need to, make sure that the impacted communities are identified, engaged, and supported as active partners in setting agendas. And so this research was guided by, groups around the country that were really concerned about lead in their water or PFAS in their water, and being able to provide the database narrative tools that are helpful in their advocacy. Water contamination must be prevented in the first place from occurring. It's much harder to remove something from the water than it is to, from your drinking water that's coming down at the point of use, than it is to prevent it from getting into the water in the first place. We need to make sure that water for infrastructure is made immediately available. And again, thinking through those processes in the Commonwealth and being advocates for change are really critical. We need to ensure that small systems are strengthened to ensure their ability to comply with the law. And we also need to understand that the Safe Drinking Water Act, must be enforced, and not just the Safe Drinking Water Act, but also the Clean Water Act and, other federal statutes should be enforced, assuming an undercurrent of structural racism that creates an unequal playing field. And so the more that we assume that, the more that we can target our enforcement actions in ways that can prevent the harms that can come through being exposed to contaminated drinking water. And then finally, the health threats and impacts, that happen with drinking water need to be addressed, disclosed, and plainly explained to community members. We found, PFAS exposure, for example, that happened in North Carolina, one of the case studies that we talk about in Watered Down Justice, that, it became, again, the poster child for PFAS contamination in drinking water. And even though it had been a national story that there was this widespread contamination, even though, large percentages of the population in that particular area are Spanish speaking, no materials on the website were in Spanish at all. And so even though I could know that, these communities are facing issues, the people that live there that are drinking the water that don't even know that there are problems because it's not being communicated to them in a way that they can understand and take action to protect themselves and their families. And then I finally just want to recognize, many of the partners that I've worked with and just been inspired by in this journey. So, I have, websites and things here. So if you're looking to give end of year donations, please look at these groups and make sure that you're supporting their work. It's really the small community-based organizations that are leading this change. And then I also want to acknowledge NRDC, which is not a small community-based organization, but for being able to provide the resources to do this work. And I thank all of you for your time. So feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to answer questions if there is time to do so.
People have questions, you can put those in the chat. But I want to begin by just asking you, Doctor, what do you think? You've put a lot of emphasis in your work on how important it is to forge community relationships and to listen to people's lived experience. Sometimes in the middle of a crisis, it's hard for people to do that or figure out how to do that. What do you think is in a community, for instance, that's suddenly facing this problem, should do both of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it starts with, again, understanding that there are communities in crisis before the crisis that you're thinking about comes about. And so building intentional, well thought out, well planned relationships with the communities across, let's say, a county or the Commonwealth or across the country that, you know, are already burdened and overburdened by environmental contamination is a good place to start. And so you don't have to wait until, you know, the crisis of the day comes up, because there's a crisis that's existed for 400 years. And so, you know, the biggest things that I would say is, you know, building up the communications channels between, you know, the particular place in which you exist and those communities that are most impacted, listening to what the needs are. Even though the work that I focus on is in environmental and nature, that doesn't mean that I don't listen to or think about criminal justice issues or education issues, or, you know, look for ways in which to support communities and the work that they're doing, even if that doesn't align with the work that my organization is doing, for example. And so I think that the more that we can, you know, just engage with people where they are and understanding the issues that are, you know, causing them, you know, stress, and which again, we know is something that, you know, modifies all of these exposures and makes them even worse for the human body, to be able to, you know, establish those relationships so that you can work together, you know, in times of, you know, no matter what time it is, if it's a current crisis or not.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing the information. And
Yeah.
we're making that watered down report, which I will say is truly amazing, available in our materials. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you
you.
so much. We are now going to turn to the Assistant Regional Counsel at the Environmental Protection Region #1 in Boston, Erin Flannery-Keith. And I'm really happy to have Erin with us today. She's going to talk about a couple of things. Erin joined the EPA in 2009 after graduating from Wellesley. She has a law degree and a certificate in environmental law from the Elizabeth Hub School of Law at Pace University. And she served as the attorney advisor in the Office of Water in the EPA's Washington headquarters until 2018. And then a native New Englander, she came back to Region 1. And her practice here really focuses on the Clean Water Act, environmental justice, and civil rights counseling. I'm excited that she's here to talk today about the EPA's new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and the highlights of what this newly launched office is focused on, both at the national and the regional level, the grants and the community assistance that can flow from that. So I think this is really a recognition of some of the things that you've been hearing about, the need to both address these issues and to do them with that equity lens. And the EPA has really taken on this issue in creating this office. So I'm delighted to welcome Erin here this morning.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can start the presentation.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay. Can everyone hear okay and also see the presentation?
Yes, we still have your notes too, Erin, if you want to switch to just your presentation. Yeah. There we go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, District Attorney Ryan. I am Erin Flannery-Keith. I work in EPA Region 1's Office of Regional Counsel. Region 1, of course, includes all of the New England states and is one of 10 EPA regions throughout the country. EPA Region 1 implements the administration's priorities and the core environmental work in New England aligned with our national practices. Today, I'll talk to you about some EPA environmental justice and civil rights program updates at the national and regional levels. I'll start with a brief overview of 3 relevant EJ executive orders that really orient our work, and we'll touch on other key legal authorities. I'll then move on to the biggest EJ news at EPA, the creation of an entirely new environmental justice and civil rights office, and also talk about how PFAS activities are integrated there and in other offices at EPA, of course. We'll cover some Region 1 specific environmental justice work and then Region 1 external civil rights work. I hope to leave time for questions, which would be wonderful to save for the end. So first, I want to emphasize that external civil rights and environmental justice really go hand in hand. EPA enforces several federal civil rights laws that together prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, disability, sex, and age, in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance from EPA. And the civil rights laws also require meaningful participation and equal access to the decision-making processes of recipients of EPA financial assistance. Most of EPA's external civil rights compliance efforts focus on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What do I mean by external? It's really looking at how outside recipients of EPA's money, what they're doing with that money, and how they're interacting with the communities that they serve. In 1994, President Clinton established the first environmental justice focused executive order, EO 12898. And it directed federal agencies for the first time to identify the disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of federal agency actions on communities with environmental justice concerns and low-income populations. It also directed federal agencies to develop EJ strategies and to promote non-discrimination in federal programs that affect human health and the environment, and to provide communities with EJ concerns access to public information and public participation opportunities. And then the Biden administration issued 2 EJ-related executive orders very early in 2021. The first is the Advancing Racial Equity Environmental Executive Order, which takes a whole of government approach. It's not EJ exclusive, but there's lots of overlap, with an emphasis on improving meaningful involvement in federal agency actions. And then the Tackling the Climate Crisis EO instructs that to secure, I'm going to read a little bit of it, the relevant parts. To secure an equitable economic future, the United States must ensure that environmental and economic justice are key considerations. That means investing in building a clean energy economy, turning disadvantaged communities, historically marginalized and overburdened, into healthy, thriving communities. And again, impressing on federal agencies that they shall make achieving environmental justice part of their missions by developing programs, policies, and activities to address environmental justice and other cumulative impacts on disadvantaged communities. And I also want to note that most of the key environmental statutes have mechanisms in them where EPA and the states can infuse environmental justice considerations. And in June 2022, EPA updated a compendium called EJ Legal Tools for EPA and state practitioners to use. It's a comprehensive look at all of the ways that the core environmental statutes like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Superfund, all allow for assessments, processes, or permit conditions that can take disparate impacts into account. So here is the biggest, latest news that Administrator Michael Regan established the brand new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights just weeks ago in September. At the launch event, Administrator Regan said, with the launch of the new National Program Office, we are embedding environmental justice and civil rights into the DNA of EPA and ensuring that people who have struggled to have their concerns addressed see action to solve the problems they've been facing for generations. This new office merges 3 existing programs, the Office of Environmental Justice, the External Civil Rights Compliance Office, and the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center, into one larger office that puts environmental justice on the same level as the other key offices at EPA, the Office of General Counsel and the Office of Water. It will eventually have a Senate-confirmed assistant administrator. And EPA has stated several goals for this new office. It really aims to improve and enhance the agency's ability to infuse equity, civil rights, and environmental justice principles and priorities into everything the EPA does. all practices, policies, and programs. It is has at its heart the idea to support fair treatment and meaningful involvement for all people with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. I think a big part of this office will be engaging communities with environmental justice concerns and increasing support through community action, through community-led grants and technical assistance that EPA can provide in every region. And the external civil rights piece of this is to strengthen the enforcement of civil rights laws like Title VI, and to prevent or remedy discrimination of recipients of federal financial assistance from EPA. And the new office will also oversee the implementation and delivery of a $3 billion block grant for climate and environmental justice created by the IRA. And it'll also include mechanisms for ensuring strong implementation of all the other funding programs that are going to be coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it'll be the office that is looking at whether that disbursement is meeting the Justice 40 goals. Senator Markey mentioned Justice 40. It's the idea of identifying disadvantaged communities through various screening processes that will then enable the federal government to know where to direct 40%, that's the 40, of overall benefits of federal investments in climate energy related infrastructure. And part of that will be funding and implementing more PFAS work in communities with EJ concerns. PFAS is at the top of Administrator Regan's priority list. And early in 2021, he established the EPA Council on PFAS, which is actually co-chaired by EPA Region 1 Regional Administrator, Deb Zaro. And then in early September 22, Senator Markey mentioned this as well, EPA proposed to designate 2 of the most prevalent PFAS substances as hazardous substances under CERCLA, the Superfund law. And one key proposal element there is to enhance the ability of federal, tribal, and state authorities to get information regarding the location and extent of PFAS releases. That proposed rule is still out for public comment. I didn't work on the rule. Some excellent colleagues did. If you're interested in that, you can find it on EPA's website or on regulations.gov. And the public comment period for that rule ends on November 7th. EPA is also ramping up capacity to distribute significant sums of money through bill, as we've heard throughout the morning. In fact, bill provides $50 billion to EPA's water programs alone. And of that amount, $5 billion is appropriated for the Emerging Contaminants Grant Program. And there's currently, I think, a call for a government-wide effort to, of course, confront PFAS pollution, and a call for states and territories to apply for $1 billion, that first $1 billion of $5 billion total, to address PFAS and other emerging contaminants in drinking water, specifically in smaller disadvantaged communities, to improve systems, remediate PFAS issues, conduct upgrades, and introduce new technology. And I'm also not part of this grants program, but would be happy to put you in touch with EPA Region 1 grants contacts if anyone desires that. So here in Region 1, environmental justice work is becoming integrated into so much of the work we do. And our regional administrator, David Cash, has ensured that. He's really made that a top priority. So this means ensuring meaningful access during public participation events like public meetings and public hearings, consulting with communities with EJ concerns about what those meetings and hearings look like. When should we hold them? What is the best time of day for communities that could be impacted by a potential permit? It's the best time of day for community members to participate. We have worked on enhanced outreach to EJ communities, holding virtual meetings and hearings that are safe during the pandemic, offering language translation and interpretation services that are tailored to the affected community. And Region 1 is also working very closely with our headquarters colleagues in DC, including in the Office of General Counsel and the new EJ office, to establish methods on how to conduct accurate and useful cumulative impacts analyses in areas with EJ concerns. And the hope there is that these analyses can inform permitting and other policy decisions in those areas and communities that are facing compounded and burdensome environmental impacts. So to cover external civil rights work in Region 1, which I spend a large amount of my time working on, Region 1 is here to help state and local governments and any other federal funding recipient of EPA's money to build their required Title VI and non-discrimination programs. This can include grievance policies. How does a member of the public contact the federal funding recipient if they sense that there has been a discriminatory intent or impact, and how the funding recipient's money is being spent? We help develop limited English proficiency plans and other non-discrimination policies that all federal funding recipients need to have in place. And before EPA awards financial assistance, applicants for EPA money must complete, and then we review a pre-award review form to provide assurance that they will comply with all federal non-discrimination requirements. And so we can help augment any missing parts of those programs as well, but that is an increasing requirement that all federal funding recipients from EPA have to ensure that they have non-discrimination programs in place. And the idea there is to prevent, not only to give meaningful access and practice a non-discrimination of in all the programs and activities that federal funding recipients do. We want to prevent communities and individuals from being harmed by any such discriminatory activities. So we do occasionally receive complaints from groups or groups of citizens, residents alleging discrimination by a recipient of federal funding, perhaps a state agency or a federal a state agency or a municipal agency. And so when we get those, we analyze them for jurisdiction. And then if appropriate, we continue on to investigate the complaint. We may enter into informal resolution agreements. And this process could also involve alternative dispute resolution between the complainant and the federal funding recipient. And we have the overall goal of bringing the federal funding recipient into compliance with the federal civil rights laws. So I will pause there and thank again the Middlesex DA's office for this opportunity to speak on environmental justice and external civil rights at EPA. And I have my contact information here in case you think of any questions or would like me to help you get in touch with any other aspects of EPA.
Erin, thank you so much. We'll add that to our drop-down menu and we'll collect the questions and forward those to you as well. But thank you so much for being with us and for talking about really this important new position that the EPA has taken on these issues. Thank you. We are going to now be joined by some really wonderful partners to talk both about the situation in Cambridge and some developments here, some really important developments here in Massachusetts. And our panel today is really made up of folks who've done an enormous amount of work on these issues. And they include, lead off with State Representative Kate Hogan, who represents the 3rd Middlesex District. She has been an outstanding leader on the precise issue that we're talking today, the forever chemicals in the water here in Massachusetts. Representative Hogan is a great friend of this office and a wonderful partner. She is someone who does the work, figures out a solution, and then works at moving that forward. And exactly on this issue in 2020, she introduced legislation to form an interagency PFAS task force, which she co-chairs with State Senator Julian Sear. And it was in response to communities in her district and in places throughout the state that were grappling with this detection. And she's really been discussing supporting the mitigation and remediation efforts and meeting the scope of this problem. The task force has an enormous charge. It has held 9 public hearings, which you may have seen have garnered an enormous amount of publicity because they've been so well attended. She's been listening to and convening legislators, agency officials, PFAS experts, and other stakeholders to really address this issue. So I'm looking forward to having her talk about that today and tell us a little bit about the findings they've made so far, the reports and recommendation. Another great friend and wonderful partner is Cambridge's Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui, who, as you heard earlier, has really had very recent experience in this, her 3rd term on the Cambridge City Council and her 2nd term as mayor with dealing with this issue in Cambridge.
Around the other way.
And her priorities, in addition to dealing with this issue, have included affordable housing, local business, and really improving the Cambridge public schools and leading Cambridge through the pandemic. She has focused so much of her support on low-income communities, whether it's increasing internet access to assist with remote learning for kids, winter support drive, taking an equity approach to that. So it was no surprise that she brought that same equity lens and listening skills to the issue that has arisen in Cambridge. And as I mentioned at the beginning, really, they did a great job in identifying the problem, very calmly putting that information out to residents, and then moving forward with a solution. So I'm happy to have her here. She's been a wonderful partner to us to talk about how they have so effectively done that work in Cambridge and what their goals are. And finally, but certainly not least, we are joined by Assistant Commissioner from the Bureau of Water Resources at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, Kathleen Baskin. And Kathleen has served in that role for the past 3 years, overseeing the state's program in wastewater, drinking water, water management, watershed planning, wetlands, and waterways. And particularly, we've known, in addition to the PFAS issue, certainly during COVID, the measuring of wastewater and all of that has become so much more critical. She's been a leader on these issues for many, many years. She brings a background as an engineer. She served as the Director of Water Policy for the Commonwealth, and she's led the state's evaluation of climate change vulnerability and the implementation of adaptation strategies. All of our panelists are obviously incredibly more accomplished and credentialed than I've had an opportunity to address, but I want to get right to the questions and give them the opportunity to use our time together to tell you about the work they've been doing. And Representative Hogan, if we could, I'm going to begin with you. And can you tell us about a few of the most important findings that have come out of your task force and the report that the task force has put out? And that report will be, again, in the materials that we're making available to everyone.
Thank you so much, DA Ryan. I'm so delighted to be here, and it's been a very interesting, I've been listening to all of the presentations. It's been very interesting as we move forward. I'm always struck by how much we're in real time in all that we're doing here with PFAS. And so happy to see that you're doing the work that you're doing with regards to identifying those communities that need the most attention and to never be left out of what is going to be a long process. My work with the issue really started in my towns, as you had discussed. It was Hudson and Stowe. Both of them showed high levels of PFAS. We responded really with a town meeting in both cases, with the DEP and with local electeds to talk about what needed to happen and how we were going to move forward. What that meant was having to figure out how we were going to move forward, because we really didn't have a roadmap and needed to invent how we were going to create our system for filtration, which we just actually had a check celebration with some of the monies that have come in on the federal side from Congresswoman Lori Trahan to Hudson, which has been incredibly important for the filtration system that's now open there and probably be something that others will look to as towns and cities move through this process. But the experience just made it clear that municipalities alone can't shoulder the significant challenges of the PFAS contamination in drinking water, and that there was a need for a comprehensive statewide response. So I proposed legislation, interagency task force for PFAS. It was sponsored along with Senator Julian Sear from the Cape, who has his own issues in and around many of those towns where a great deal of PFAS has been detected. The task force convened 9 public hearings. Testimony was both informative, moving, and so very educational from scientists, industry experts, government agencies, local authorities. And we did identify a clear need to provide assistance to towns, private well owners, and fire departments in particular. But we also discovered, as we are all gathered here today, that environmental justice communities may be disproportionately impacted by PFAS contamination. In Massachusetts, 400 facilities are known or potential sources of PFAS and located within 3-mile radius environmental justice communities. Low-income communities are less likely to have resources for PFAS detection and remediation. Outreach regarding PFAS conducted only in English. Many of these points that I'm making were brought up earlier, and glad to see that we're hitting some things on the mark. And residents of environmental justice communities may be more likely to consume recreationally caught fish, which is another issue as we live on the coast, and many lakes and contaminated bodies of water that have elevated levels of PFAS that we may not even have identified. The task force concluded with 30 recommendations for addressing. I am certainly not at this point in the morning going to go through the 30. But these recommendations build upon current efforts within the state and across the country to meet the significant challenges that we face. The primary approach, this is the thing I think that's most important, the primary approach and aim, the upcoming bill to be filed, is to build an infrastructure of laws that rids the environment of these forever chemicals and allows for continued work in real time as we find PFAS in the environment. And supporting our environmental justice communities is a key component of our recommendations, and will be certainly a part of our bill that will be filed in the 193rd session starting in January of 2023, including providing additional support for communities through loan forgiveness for PFAS remediation projects, because really everything comes down to money in so many ways when we're dealing with these, and especially as we say in a crisis, it's the money that we need to deal with discovery and remediation, as well as community outreach. And since the conclusion of the task force, we've also had several of the task force recommendations to address PFAS contamination. Mass DEP received a significant increase in their FY23 budget with a focus on PFAS related work and assistance. FY23, and this is a state budget that I'm speaking of, we were able to allot $250,000 for a second round of AFFF take back program. We haven't talked much about firefighters today, but foam and contamination are well known to firehouses around Massachusetts and around firehouses across the country. The funding will allow the Mass DEP to collect and properly dispose of legacy firefighting foam. The older the foam, the more intense the amounts of PFAS that will be found. And so what we're trying to do is rid the Commonwealth of those storage areas where old PFAS is found. We also appropriated 21 million of ARPA funds to be provided as loan forgiveness for PFAS remediation projects, the Clean Water Trust, also ARPA funded water infrastructure grants, which can receive 20% loan forgiveness on top of other loan forgiveness provided provided by the state, and some communities may be eligible for a 40% loan forgiveness when you combine it with the Clean Water Trust Disadvantaged Community Program. Again, another look and nod, and certainly attention paid to communities, disadvantaged communities. And in May, Attorney General Maura Healey sued 15 manufacturers. I'm sure you're well aware of this, DA Ryan, for PFAS used in firefighting foam, for causing millions of dollars in damages to communities across Massachusetts, as well as health problems with our firefighters. And we are currently working with staff to draw up an omnibus bill to be filed with 193rd session. Again, I go back to the important thing for us is to set up a calendar that says by a certain date, we will no longer be using PFAS. PFAS will no longer be in the environment. And also looking, for instance, in the case of children, that we stop it at the stream, and also that we have priority products that we would like to see removed earlier. And that would, of course, be children's products to start. And that would be a big focus for us as we write the bill, that would be incredibly important, that we not only have a deadline date, but we also have a top priority for other things as well. So that's sort of the introduction to it. It's I don't want to be long or take too much time, but I did want to emphasize the fact that our goal is really to look at how we can set up ways to say this will no longer be something that's entering our environment in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Representative. Mayor, you had the experience of in doing the testing, detecting those high levels of PFAS in your water supply, and having to make the decision to divert to the different water source. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that process was like, as well as sort of the long-term goal for Cambridge? I know the city's in the process of doing away with its old filtration system and as installing that new granular charcoal activated carbon filter. And what do you anticipate sort of for timeline? What will this mean for Cambridge? And finally, sort of how did you deal with the community in all of this, with letting people know? I mean, I think everybody agrees Cambridge did a great job in getting that information out to ways that people could protect themselves.
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here, and thanks to the DA for organizing this event. So the update in Cambridge is that we're right now, our water source is the MWRA. We temporarily switched in late August. We first detected these PFAS compounds in our local water in August of 2019. So since then, we were very much monitoring and making sure that we were in compliance with the Mass DEP regulation and guidelines. But the initial results for August showed PFAS levels trending upwards, and September results are generally highest. So out of an abundance of caution, our water department said it'd be the best decision to switch to MWRA water to eliminate any potential health effects from PFAS levels above the Mass DEP regulations. And since then, that decision did come with a lot of thought, and we definitely since 2019 we're actively monitoring for PFAS in our water supply and reservoirs, the Hobbs Brook, Stony Brook, and Fresh Pond, to really stay on top of the emerging issue. And when we think about the long-term goal, it's what the rep has said, it's what others have said. We want to really get rid of these compounds. In Cambridge, our goal is to minimize the levels of the PFAS compounds in our water to below 10 ppt, and possibly to no level and be to zero. And we know that this could be done as you mentioned, by replacing the granular activated carbon filter media in our existing filters. So I think it's really important we get to zero or as close as possible, since we really don't know the long-term effects that the PFAS compounds have. And it's been shown through various pilot study testing that this filter can significantly reduce PFAS levels, and it's anticipated that the water department replacing this filter annually will maintain a very low or no detect levels of PFAS compounds in our drinking water. And right now, the water department has actually, we've started the change out of the filter media in 2 of the 6 filters to be completed this month, 2 more in November, and the last 2 in December. So once the first 2 filters are tested and PFAS removal, it's confirmed, we will, the plan is to blend our water with MWRA water, and as more filters are changed out, fully switch back to Cambridge water. And this has been a big learning experience for me, having not, I'm not a expert in this area by any means. And for me, it's been about how does the regular normal person react to getting this information, and what does it mean for their day-to-day. And clean and safe drinking water is such an important factor for quality of life. So it was very understandable that people in our community had serious concern when we decided to make the switch. And then there were a lot of questions, and I think there are a lot of lessons learned in the communication. I think, in some ways the media got ahead of the news, and people, while we set we've sent the information out, there was, because it was the timing of late August, people were still like, wait, I learned about this from the news and a Globe article. And so, I think in hindsight, we wouldn't want, I think, more effective communication when it comes to this issue, and, centering equity. How do we do it in multiple languages? How do we get the information out to everyone in a timely manner? 84% of the population in Cambridge is part of this environmental justice community designation. So, everything we do in Cambridge when it comes to providing resources and information has to be done in that equity lens, and water quality and water issues is no different. So, our goal after the city switched sources has been to reassure our community members that the water is safe to drink, and that we will not switch back until there's certainty that our local water is safe. And the temporary switch is costing the city about $2 million a month. And we're really trying to work fast and diligently and make sure we're getting the right information out and effective information to our community on this issue. So that's a little, just a brief summary of where we're at, and what we're hoping to achieve in the next through the end of the year at least.
Thank you, Anne. And Commissioner Baskin, can you tell us kind of how the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection thinks about these environmental justice issues? And specifically, we heard Dr. Messerlian talk about how living in Brookline, she has run into trouble with trying to put in a filtration system. Are there in Massachusetts mechanisms for individuals and families to qualify for those free filtration systems? Are there rebate programs? How do we make, we talked earlier about in Cambridge, the point of source filters are certainly affordable for some residents of Cambridge. They're not so affordable for others. So how are you thinking about that?
Well, thank you very much for the question. So first of all, how does Mass DEP consider environmental justice in its business? And I'll just tell you what our business is to protect public health and the environment. And where I work is in the water side of that. So everyone has the right to be protected from environmental hazards and to live and enjoy a clean and healthy environment, including having access to clean drinking water, which is what we're talking about today. And I would say all of Mass DEP's decisions around funding opportunities, so those are grants or the very large state revolving fund loans that we award, the permitting, any key agency action must consider environmental justice. And this is not just policy, but this is part of the climate law that the legislature enacted recently. And so we are taking this very seriously. Commissioner Suberg and Secretary Card have been, actually Commissioner Suberg has convened the senior management at Mass DEP for 2.5 years on a weekly basis to discuss environmental justice and equity within the agency, and to determine how to make advancements. So, while that's occurring, we're also grateful to the federal government for the bipartisan infrastructure law, which provides a lot of money for water infrastructure, but does it with a lens that ensures that the disadvantaged communities will be considered, that they will be getting the free money, the grants, the subsidies. So that's really important to us too. And I think that the partnership between what the federal lawmakers have done and the policy behind environmental justice, as well as the federal funding that's come along, our state legislature with its definition around environmental justice under the climate law, and our own implementation has really put environmental justice at the forefront. I'm missing a meeting right now where we are talking about which permits would require a mandatory public involvement plan that would do outreach to environmental justice communities. And the folks in the meeting are discussing the recommendations that I put forward for the Bureau of Water Resources. So this is going on throughout the agency. Now, in terms of Brookline and that specific case, and your question about free filtration systems for the private well owner. So there's two, we get water, we're either on a public water system or a private well. And I'll note the public water systems, we have had testing done. We are under our drinking water standard for PFAS, which we advanced 2 years ago. We're at our 2-year anniversary. We're a little bit ahead of the federal government on that. We have required monitoring, and I'll just clarify that while there are certain stats, it's very easy to take certain statistics and come to conclusions. But we have 30 communities that have tested, that currently have drinking water that exceeds our PFAS level, and that's of the 449 that need to test. 95% of the people who are on public water are drinking water that's below our current standard. So I just want to make sure people know that. But there are about 10% of the people in the Commonwealth are not on a public water system. They're on their own private wells. And unfortunately, there is a gap there in terms of what's available to them. So Mass DEP does not regulate, nor does it have funding for private wells. We are really grateful that we did get some funding to test private wells from the legislature through 2 supplemental budgets. And that gave us an idea of what the landscape might look like in terms of private wells. But the private wells are regulated by the Department of Public Health. They also don't have funding to provide these point of use or point of entry systems in a home. Now, with respect to Brookline, I would say, although the professor is not able to reconfigure her plumbing at her rental property in Brookline, a test for lead in water is quite inexpensive. So it is something that she could test herself, contact a commercial laboratory, find out how to properly collect the sample, bring the sample in, and get an idea of whether at what level her lead is. The other thing she can do is work with her local Department of Public Works to find out, this is the most important thing about lead, is there a lead service line coming into her house from the street? Because there's not lead in the Mass Water Resources Authority water that we're concerned about. That's not the issue. The issue in Massachusetts water supplies is the water traveling through lead pipes on the way into your house? And often what happens is there's two pieces to the pipe, or it's a pipe, but it's owned partially by the municipality up to the property line, and then it's owned by the private homeowner. And you got to get the whole piece out in order to solve the problem. So these municipalities, the public water systems, have a difficult time entering into the private property to get those pieces, that part of the lead service line out. Luckily, thank goodness, the federal government, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, has provided a lot of funding for that. Senator Markey mentioned $65 million a year over the next 5 years. So this is a great opportunity for municipalities to partner with their local property owners to address lead service lines. So I would say to the professor, find out from your DPW how to test to see if you have a lead service line. And there's a way, to visually look at that, or they may have a record of it. And also do a water test. You can buy a simple filter like a Brita filter and use that also as another line of protection. So thank you.
Representative Hogan, I know that you are always a great listener. And tell us, to close us out, I think, really in all of the hearings that you conducted, about what you heard that either most surprised you or motivated you in moving forward on this work.
I would have to say it was both the ubiquitous nature of PFAS, that it is everywhere, that every single person in the United States is more than likely, if they don't live in very, very isolated areas, that you have PFAS in your body, that you have been exposed to PFAS, whether it's where we live, what we drink, from schools, what we buy. It's really ubiquitous. And, what we're trying to do is stop PFAS from entering the environment by passing laws that say this is, the PFAS needs to be removed from the environment. And we're starting with children, because we heard stories, especially of those most vulnerable, whether it's immune compromised children, the elderly. They're much more apt to really feel the effects of PFAS, especially when you think about young children accumulating PFAS through the course of their life, because of course, going back to the point, it does not go away. It is known as a forever chemical for a reason. It was also very enlightening and very moving to hear testimony from firefighters. They had PFAS in their gear, and they put it on every time they go to a fire, as well as we know now PFAS that was both in foam in the day and foam as well today. It's just different levels of PFAS. How important it is to ensure that we make our firefighters safe, in the fact that they don't need to be wearing clothes filled with what we know now to be carcinogenic. And those were really what affected me the most, and really made me understand how important it is to take it out of our environment. And also, we were talking about drinking water. There should be no levels. We should be, the good news is, although we're in real time and sort of figuring out as we go, we can remove PFAS from your tap. You just need to be able to install what's needed and what filter of choice you have in your home. There, you should not be drinking PFAS out of your tap. And so that has been something that's very important for me to both understand, to be able to implement, and to maybe make other people understand as well, that we have the ways to filter. What we need to do now is remediation, and more importantly, to ensure that we take it out upstream, so it's not entering the environment and we're not all scrambling to figure out what to do next.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us today. I want to thank all of you for